He lived at the end of the street, in a small weathered house with overgrown hedges and a mailbox that hadn't been painted in years. Most people on Maple Street didn't know much about him, only that his name was Mr. Carter, and he'd lived there for over a decade. He rarely spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary, and even then his words were quiet, short and clipped. A nod here, a grunt there, maybe a tired good morning, if someone caught him off guard. He never seemed angry or hostile, just distant, detached from the rest of the world, like someone watching life unfold from behind a glass wall. Neighbors would occasionally see him during odd hours, taking out his trash at midnight, coming home just before dawn, or standing on his porch, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing in particular. He didn't engage in small talk, never attended block parties or community events, and didn't decorate his house for the holidays. While other homes glowed with Christmas lights or displayed carved pumpkins in October, his remained dark and silent, windows always closed, curtains always drawn. Despite this, most people didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood had its loner, and as far as anyone could tell, he never caused trouble. Kids sometimes joked that his house was haunted, daring each other to ring his doorbell on Halloween, but no one ever actually saw him answer. He became one of those local mysteries, someone the neighborhood grew used to without ever understanding. Some said he worked nights. Others claimed he had a health condition and preferred to stay indoors. A few whispered that he had once had a family, but they had moved away or passed on. No one really knew. He had no visitors, no friends dropping by, no packages delivered, and never seemed to leave town. Occasionally, neighbors would hear strange sounds coming from the house, odd thumps, metallic clanks, or a low humming late at night, but these were dismissed as nothing more than the quirks of an old building. There were more subtle signs, too. His yard, though never maintained, was never completely overgrown, almost as if someone trimmed just enough to avoid complaints. His blinds were always at the exact same angle. His car was clean but never seemed to move. These details, while minor on their own, painted a picture of someone meticulous, calculated, and deliberately private. Yet even with these small hints, nobody gave them much weight. Older residents recalled seeing him more often in the early years, walking to the store, nodding to neighbors. But over time, those glimpses became rare. It was like he was gradually erasing himself from the community without ever actually leaving. People grew used to his absence, to the silence from his house, and eventually stopped asking questions. He became part of the landscape, a quiet fixture no one paid attention to unless they had to. Despite how isolated he seemed, there was something about him that made people uneasy, not enough to act on, but enough to avoid prolonged interaction. The way he averted eye contact, how his clothes never changed much, the way he always seemed to be listening without reacting. If a stranger asked about him, the most common response was a shrug followed by, "He keeps to himself." It was the sort of phrase people used to move past discomfort, to smooth over the gaps in what they didn't understand. Looking back, there were so many small signs, so many moments that could have raised alarms if anyone had looked more closely. But at the time, he was just the quiet guy at the end of the street, someone who minded his own business, someone people didn't feel the need to bother, someone who lived alone, someone they barely noticed at all. It started off as something subtle, something easy to ignore, a faint, sour odor that occasionally drifted through the air when the wind shifted just right. At first, people thought it was a dead animal, maybe a raccoon or stray cat that had crawled under a porch and died. It wasn't unheard of in a neighborhood surrounded by trees and aging homes. The scent would come and go. One day it would be strong, the next it would vanish completely. Most residents chalked it up to the change of seasons or the nearby drainage, ditch that sometimes gave off unpleasant smells after heavy rain. But then the smell didn't go away. Instead, it got worse, more persistent, stronger, and it wasn't just outside anymore. People living in the houses closest to Mr. Carter's began to notice it creeping into their vents, seeping through windows and lingering in their entryways. A thick, acrid stench that clung to fabric and made people wrinkle their noses and check their garbage bins. One neighbor, a woman who lived directly next door, thought maybe it was mold in her crawl space or something rotting in her attic. She Paid for an inspection, but nothing was found. As the days passed, the odor grew even more unbearable. The mail carrier began skipping his daily stop at Mr. Carter's mailbox, preferring to leave the letters bundled with a neighbour's instead. When asked why, he mentioned the smell, how it hit him in the face the second he approached the front steps. He said it made his eyes water, that it was like something died in there. By the second week, the smell had become a hot topic of conversation at every backyard fence and neighbourhood gathering. Parents walking their kids to school crossed the street to avoid passing too close. Dog walkers tugged their pets away from the yard, and children weren't allowed to ride their bikes past the house anymore. No one knew what it was exactly, but everyone knew it was coming from that house, Mr. Carter's house. Still, no one went over to ask him about it. He wasn't the kind of man people casually knocked on the door to check in on. Besides, no one had seen him in a few days. The curtains were still drawn, as always. The porch light, which usually flickered faintly through the night, had gone out. His car remained parked in the same place it had been for weeks, coated in a thin layer of pollen and dust. No movement, no sound, nothing to suggest anyone was inside. Theories began to circulate. Maybe he had gone on a trip and left food rotting inside. Maybe he was sick or worse. Maybe an animal had gotten into the house and died in the walls. Someone even joked in poor taste that maybe he was dead in there himself. But no one laughed. The smell was too real, too heavy, too unnatural to be part of a joke. One family a few houses down, whose windows faced the back of Mr. Carter's property, started noticing an unusual number of flies gathering near his back door. The husband mentioned it at a neighbourhood meeting, visibly disturbed by the growing swarm that seemed to hover there, no matter the time of day. He said he tried to look over the fence, but couldn't see anything. Others had noticed too. The insects. The way the air near the house seemed warmer, heavier, almost sticky. A few neighbours considered calling someone, maybe animal control, maybe the police, but hesitated. No one wanted to overreact. What if it was nothing? What if it was just an old man dealing with something embarrassing? But the smell didn't let them forget. It was always there now, lurking in every breeze, curling into every open window. Emily had always been a quiet observer. She lived across the street from Mr. Carter's house and had seen him countless times over the years, watering his grass at dusk, collecting his mail in the early morning, disappearing into the shadows of his front door without ever looking around. She never spoke to him directly, never waved, but she noticed things. She noticed when his porch light went out and never came back on. She noticed when the newspaper stopped disappearing from his doorstep. And she noticed when the strange smell that had plagued the neighbourhood for days grew so intense it made her nauseous when she stepped outside. At first she thought it was something on her own property. She cleaned out her trash bins, checked her crawl space, even called a pest control company to inspect for dead rodents. But everything came up clean. The stench didn't seem to originate from her home, and when she stood in her driveway and followed the foul wind, it became clear. It was coming from across the street, from his house. She wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business. She didn't gossip much, didn't attend neighbourhood meetings, and often kept to herself. But something about this situation wouldn't let her rest. It wasn't just the smell, though, that was unbearable. It was the stillness, the absolute silence from that house, the way the curtains didn't move, how the windows reflected only darkness no matter the time of day, how not a single light had flickered on in over a week. It was as if the house itself had fallen into a coma. She brought it up casually with a neighbour while they were both checking their mail. He mentioned the flies, the ones gathering in thick black clouds near the side door. Another neighbour chimed in about how the mail was piling up, untouched. Someone else said they saw a raccoon crawl under the deck and never come out. They all talked in hushed tones, nervous, unsure. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out, loud. That night, Emily stood at her window and stared at the house across the street. It was barely visible in the low light, just a shadow of its usual shape. But even in the dark, she could feel that something was wrong, something unnatural. Her stomach turned at the thought of what might be inside, what could be the cause of that awful, persistent smell. It was the kind of scent that didn't fade with time. It grew, it invaded, it demanded attention. She hesitated for another day, hoping someone else would take the first step. But no one did. So finally, after nearly a week of unbearable suspicion, she picked up the phone and called the non-emergency police line. Her voice was quiet but steady. She explained what she had noticed, what the neighbors had been saying, how the house seemed abandoned, but not in the usual way. She described the smell in as much detail as she could bear and emphasized the fact that no one had seen Mr. Carter in days. The dispatcher took her seriously. Maybe it was the smell. Maybe it was the pile-up of mail, the reports of flies, or the eerie silence that pushed the situation over the line. Whatever it was, Emily felt a strange mix of dread and relief when the dispatcher told her that officers would be sent to perform a welfare check. She thanked them and hung up, then stood at her window again, staring across the street, heart racing, unsure of what she had just set in motion. When the police arrived, it was early afternoon. 2 officers pulled up in a patrol car, parked just beyond Mr. Carter's driveway, and stepped out with a quiet kind of urgency. Emily watched from behind her living room curtain, barely breathing. Other neighbors peeked out too, some through blinds, others stepping onto their porches, under the pretense of sweeping or watering plants. No one said a word. Everyone was watching. The officers knocked first, just like protocol required. One stood on the front step, the other off to the side, hand resting casually near his belt. They waited, knocked again. No answer. The officer on the step called out, raising his voice slightly. Still nothing. After a pause, one officer stepped back and radioed in. The other tried the door. Locked. They moved around the house cautiously, scanning the windows, checking the sides, calling out again with no response. The backyard gate was shut but not locked, and when they pushed it open, a thick swarm of flies buzzed into the air. One of the officers recoiled slightly, waving his hand at the insects. The smell was unmistakable now. Putrid, warm, and suffocating, it seemed to radiate from every crevice of the old house. Whatever they had suspected, it was worse than that. When they reached the back door, one of them noticed something odd. The glass on the door had been blacked out, covered completely from the inside, and a heavy bar had been fastened across it. They tried knocking again. Then the officer closest to the frame leaned in, pressed his face near a small crack in the edge of the door. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped back and looked at his partner. A silent exchange passed. Between them, and without another word, they radioed for permission to enter the house. Within minutes, another unit arrived. A supervisor stepped out with a toolkit, followed by a third officer carrying a small battering ram. They didn't hesitate. A few hard swings, and the back door splintered. The flies erupted, pouring into the air like a cloud escaping confinement. The stench that followed made the officers gag. One of them stumbled back a few feet, coughing violently. The others pressed on. Inside the house, it was dark, unnaturally dark. Every window had been covered, some with boards, others with thick black cloth nailed into the frames. The air inside was heavy, humid, dense with decay. Flashlights swept across the interior, revealing cluttered furniture, strange stains on the walls, and objects that looked out of place. There was no sound, no motion, not even the hum of an appliance. It was as if the house itself had been frozen in a single dreadful moment. The entryway was barricaded with furniture, chairs, boxes, even a dresser stacked against the inside of the front door. Whoever had been inside didn't want to be found. Every room was sealed in some way, doors locked from the inside, windows covered and nailed shut. The officers had to force their way through, breaking latches, shoving obstacles aside. Each step deeper into the house brought new horrors. Rotting food on counters, an overwhelming smell of bleach and filth, and strange, scribbled notes stuck to walls with tape. They cleared the first floor slowly, methodically. No sign of movement. No response to their calls. Then they reached the basement door. It was locked with 3 separate mechanisms, a padlock, a sliding bolt, and an internal latch. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep whatever was behind it from being accessed. One officer radioed in again, requesting tools to force it open. The others waited, weapons drawn, faces pale beneath their uniforms. The entire house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The basement door groaned under the force of the officer's tools, each strike louder than the last, echoing through the silent house. It took several hard blows before the old wood cracked and splintered, finally giving way. As the door creaked, open, a rush of air surged upward, hot, thick and rotten, more powerful than anything they had encountered in the rest of the house. The flashlight beams cut through the pitch-black descent, revealing narrow wooden stairs coated in dust and grime. Cobwebs hung like curtains, undisturbed for what looked like years. The walls were damp, the air humid, and something about the stillness made the officers instinctively lower their voices. One officer went down first, his steps slow and careful, hand gripping the railing while the other held his light steady. The others followed close behind. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. Mold lined the walls in patches and the smell of decay grew unbearable. As the beam of light scanned the floor, it revealed a large cluttered room filled with old furniture, broken tools, and piles of unidentifiable junk. But what drew their attention immediately was the back wall, specifically what appeared to be a wall that didn't belong. It was newer than the rest, built with fresher wood, more uniform, and covered partially with a tarp. One officer approached it, running his gloved hand along the seams, then gently tapping it with his flashlight. It echoed slightly, like there was space behind it. A hidden room. They found the edge of the wall near the corner where the construction was less secure. Carefully they pried a board loose, and behind it a narrow gap revealed darkness beyond. As they widened the opening, a putrid gust escaped, one that made two officers gag and step back, covering their faces with their sleeves. The lead officer pushed his way inside, flashlight first, revealing a chamber no one expected. It wasn't large, just big enough for a twin-sized mattress, a small metal bucket, and a few scattered items that looked like toys. The room was windowless, with thick padding lining the walls, possibly to muffle sound. On the mattress, surrounded by dirty blankets and empty food containers, was a person. A girl. She didn't move at first, her eyes squinting in the sudden burst of light. Her limbs looked frail, her skin pale and marked with bruises and cuts. The officers froze for a moment, shocked, then sprang into action. One of them knelt down and gently called to her, asking her name, asking if she could hear him. She blinked, her lips dry and cracked, her voice a faint whisper they could barely hear. But she was alive. Medical help was called immediately. As they waited, the officers carefully helped her sit up, wrapping her in a blanket one had carried. And from the squad car. She was too weak to stand. Her eyes darted around as if afraid something or someone was still watching. The room itself told a story without needing words. Metal hooks embedded in the walls, faded drawings scratched into the padding, initials carved into the wood near the floor. Back upstairs, other officers continued to search the house, looking for any other hidden areas, any other signs of what had been happening inside. But nothing else compared to what they had found in the basement. As paramedics arrived and carried the girl out on a stretcher, the neighbors who had gathered behind yellow tape gasped in silence. No one had known. No one had guessed that such a room could exist beneath their feet, behind false walls in the very heart of their neighborhood. The paramedics moved quickly, carefully lifting the frail girl from the basement chamber and securing her on the stretcher. She looked disoriented, her eyes darting between the unfamiliar faces, lips trembling as though trying to form words she hadn't used in a long time. One medic placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and spoke softly, reassuring her, though she barely responded. Her body was thin, almost skeletal, as if she hadn't seen sunlight or proper nutrition in months. Her clothes were torn and filthy, and her skin bore the raw signs of prolonged neglect. Faded bruises, healing cuts, and grime that no amount of soap could erase quickly. She had been missing for over 6 months. Posters had once been taped to light poles and pinned to bulletin boards at local grocery stores. Social media posts had circulated her photo, smiling, full of life, alongside desperate pleas from her parents. But over time, those posts had been shared less and less. Hope had quietly thinned. Rumors had swirled, people speculated, and eventually, she became another fading case in the growing list of the vanished. Until now. As the ambulance doors closed behind her, the sirens began to wail and the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind stunned silence. The officers who remained were visibly shaken, their composure cracked by what they had just witnessed. One officer leaned against the patrol car, staring blankly across the street. Another kept looking back at the house, as if struggling to understand how something so horrific could have been hidden so thoroughly in such a quiet place. The forensic team arrived shortly after, unloading cameras, evidence bags, and other gear. They moved systematically, documenting every room, every object, every inch of the basement and the false wall that had kept her hidden. It was clear this hadn't been a spontaneous crime. This had taken planning, time. The padding on the walls, the locks on the basement door, the boarded windows, everything was constructed with deliberate care. Whoever built that room didn't intend for anyone to find her. Ever. Outside, news crews began arriving, alerted by the police scanner traffic. Reporters huddled near the yellow tape, whispering to their cameramen, waiting for confirmation. Word spread fast. Neighbours who had previously kept a cautious distance now stood in clusters on sidewalks and driveways, their faces twisted in disbelief. Some shook their heads. Others cried openly. No one could comprehend it. They had walked past that house every day. Their children had ridden bikes just feet away from it. And all the while, a girl had been trapped inside, hidden in darkness just a few walls away. Detectives began interviewing neighbours, trying to piece together a timeline. They asked about comings and goings, any visitors, any noise or odd activity. But most of the responses were the same. He kept to himself. He was quiet. No one really noticed anything unusual, except, of course, the smell. And now, in hindsight, so many little things felt more sinister. The blackout curtains, the boarded windows, the lights that never turned on, the absence of visitors, the silence. Inside the house, the investigators continued their grim work. They found notebooks filled with disturbing scribbles, crude drawings taped to the walls, and a detailed log written in shaky handwriting. It documented feeding times, punishments, and cryptic notes that hinted at a twisted worldview. These findings painted a chilling portrait of someone who had lived in plain sight, fully immersed in something unthinkable. Every page added another layer to the horror. The girl's name was confirmed through a photo lineup. Her identity matched with the missing persons database. She had been found less than half a mile from where she disappeared. She hadn't been taken to some distant place. She had been kept right here, surrounded by people, behind sealed doors, beneath the floor of a house that everyone had learned to ignore. The arrest of Mr. Carter was almost anticlimactic in comparison to the horror that had unfolded. By the time the police had finished securing the basement, the detectives turned their attention to the house's owner. He hadn't been seen since the welfare check had begun, but his car was still parked in the driveway. His absence wasn't quite as surprising as it should have been. After all, the man had lived in isolation for years. But something felt different now. The absence of his presence was no longer just a strange habit. It was a stark, intentional disappearance. The officers moved methodically, surrounding the house, checking each entry point. One officer knocked on the door once more, louder this time, but there was no response. Another officer looked up at the attic window, noticing it was slightly ajar. They didn't know if it was him, but they needed to find out. They decided to break the door down. They moved quickly, battering the front door open, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. Once inside, the house felt colder, more sterile. The heavy air of neglect seemed almost deliberate. Every room was pristine, untouched, not a speck of dust out of place. It was as if the house itself had been prepared for something, for someone. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of hurried departure. Mr. Carter had left everything behind, and yet it was clear he hadn't planned on staying gone for long. The search continued through the empty rooms, down the hallway, past the stairs and into the kitchen. On the counter, the detectives found something odd. Sealed containers filled with food, all meticulously labeled with dates. The food wasn't fresh. It had been prepared and preserved long ago. The more the officers uncovered, the more unsettling it became. The house wasn't a home. It was a holding cell, an empty shell waiting for its next occupant. Upstairs, the same. Search continued. One of the officers, a senior detective, noticed a door slightly ajar at the far end of the hallway. It was a bedroom, but it looked like a place frozen in time. There were no personal items, no photographs, no mementos. The yakash bed was perfectly made, the floor clean. But what stood out the most were the thick curtains drawn tight, blocking any natural light. It wasn't just the absence of warmth or light, it was the absence of life. The detective's heart rate picked up as he stepped inside. There, in the corner of the room, something caught his eye. A small door hidden beneath the baseboard, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He crouched down, tapping the wood lightly. It echoed hollow, as if something else lay beyond it. He motioned to his team, and together they worked to pry it open. Behind the secret panel was a narrow passageway that led to a small, dimly lit closet-like space. Inside, the officers found a makeshift bed of blankets, more canned food, and what appeared to be a journal, its pages filled with scribbled, disturbing notes. The writing was erratic, almost manic in its pacing. The messages were filled with references to controlling behavior, obedience, and the need for silence. The further they read, the more they realized that Mr. Carter had been keeping a journal of his own, tracking the girl's every move, documenting her existence as if she were an experiment, a possession. There were instructions written in the margins, reminders for feeding times, tasks to be performed, and harshly underlined warnings not to let anyone discover the truth. It was clear now that Mr. Carter hadn't just hidden her from the world. He had planned to keep her there indefinitely. The detectives couldn't help but think back to the house itself, the clean surfaces, the emptiness, the absence of anything personal, and it became clear Mr. Carter had built this house to conceal his secret. It was a place designed to keep his victim locked away, out of sight and mind for as long as he needed. He had made it an art almost. Every room, every hallway, every hidden nook was designed with a singular, twisted purpose. As the team continued their search, the detectives gathered more evidence, papers, receipts, photographs of the girl taken from a distance, always carefully staged. But Mr. Carter was still nowhere to be found. His absence became increasingly deliberate as the hours passed, and the fear began to grow. Was he simply hiding, or had he planned to disappear for good? With each passing hour, the question loomed larger. What kind of person could live in a house like this in plain sight, and commit such a crime with such chilling calculation? The neighborhood had known him as the quiet, unremarkable neighbor. And now, with the evidence mounting, it was clear that Mr. Carter's life was anything but ordinary.